Hi everyone, welcome to Man's Search for Meaning. I want to make this solo cast as an attempt to make a debut episode where I guess I'm just trying to express why I even started doing this podcast. I have a few topics that I would like to address and talk about. I feel inspired to do that now. Throughout this podcast, as I study, I have this need in my life to talk about things that I study, to speak about them out loud, because it's a better way for me to A, articulate them, and B, to substantiate them in my mind. What I want to do as I do this podcast is write down certain topics that I want to talk about that I'm studying, and then after I've accumulated enough of those, I will host a solo cast where I'll talk about these topics. But today's going to be a little bit different because I'm aiming for this to be the first recording. The podcast itself is not going to be a solo cast, but rather a conversation. First of all, let's talk about the name. Man's Search for Meaning is a book by Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist during World War II, a Jewish psychologist. He lived in Germany. And as you can imagine, if you're a Jew and you live in Germany in World War II, he was in a concentration camp. And not only in a concentration camp, he was hosted, so to speak, in Auschwitz, which was arguably the worst concentration camp. Excuse me. The whole book talks about his experience there and in other camps, not in a way of just documenting his experience, but rather explaining how he saw these things philosophically. The most interesting thing about Viktor Frankl is that he found a very interesting thing. What he found was that the people who survived the death camps, the people who made it through the Nazi hate machine, are the people who haven't lost this internal component that a human being uniquely has. In other words, he realized that the Nazis can take away their freedom, their food, even their physical bodies, but they can't take away the meaning behind whatever it is that they're doing, the reason why they think they're here. And the meaning he found is something that gives a man or a woman purpose. When you have a meaning as a human being, suddenly everything has more weight behind it. I found that to be correct in my life. Whenever something became meaningful to me, I was able to do it better, or I was able to have more energy behind it, or I did it with more love in my heart. I found that with my clients as well. When something becomes meaningful to them, they'll be more motivated to try it. And even if they're not motivated, they still have the meaning behind it. And that gives things power. So I guess my attempt in this podcast is to find meaning behind what all of this is, What is this that we're doing here on this planet? I don't mean life in general, but I specifically want to niche down to men because I think that there's a problem right now for men. Whether it is through social media, who is in a way part of this, men today have lost meaning. Men today lost what it means to be a man, what it means to be alive. Of course, I'm speaking in generalities, but it seems to me like there's a lot of men out there who don't know what it means to live as a man who has a meaning behind everything they do. Because let's face it, playing video games 24 hours a day, which is something that I did a lot as a young man who was lost, who was bitter, is a very nihilistic thing to do, right? It's kind of opting out of the world. There is this Japanese term, I think it's called hikikimori. I'm butchering this, yeah, but it's essentially a term for a man who opted out of society. And it is the men who live in their parents' basement, playing video games all day, have AI girlfriends living in chat rooms and whatnot. And I think this is something that is dangerous. The reason it's dangerous is because men and masculine energy in general is all about leadership. It's not that women are meant to follow. Women can totally be in leadership roles. Like, I don't like to be. I would like you to assume that whatever I'm saying. I would like you to assume my highest motive. I wouldn't like you to assume that I'm trying to demean women or hate women. Let's speak at a higher frequency here. Nobody here hates anybody. At the same time, men, if you look throughout history, are the leaders. They are the people who build, who eventually lead. And I think that when we have a crisis in that, we have a serious problem. Not to get too conspiratorial, but I do believe that there is a technocratic elite out there, which are people who have a lot of money and a certain agenda. Not evil people, but people who believe that their agenda tops everything else and that the end justifies the means. And these men want power and more power so they can apply that agenda. And I believe that men are a big barrier to these people because men can resist. And throughout history, men have resisted these kind of power usurpers. These usurpers are not working in democratic means, and these people don't give a flying fuck about democratic means. But they want to take the power to their hands. And for them, it is good that there are people out there, men and women alike, who are clueless, who are asleep, who are dormant. And I want to wake those people up because I think this is the way to save mankind. And what better way, in my opinion, to wake people up than to wake up men to critically think, to spread the word, to lead happy lives, to lead relationships, to lead homes, to flourish together with a beautiful woman who empowers them, who they empower her, and to create families, which is the nuclear building block of human society. And this is why there is such a big assault on families right now. This is why they're trying to get divorce rates to be as high as they can, and they're doing a pretty good job at that. This is why there's so many people today who are single or in a casual relationship, and there's less and less people who are married, less and less people are having kids. And the people who do have kids, most of the time, they don't even know why they want to have kids. They're just doing it because they think they need to. And they're not really thinking about the deeper meaning behind it. Again, I'm trying to stay focused here because, like I said, this solo cast is like an attempt for me to think out loud and to kind of speak my mind. But at the same time, I do want to stay anchored to certain topics that I have on my head. I'm going to bring guests in here that are incredible. I want to bring people who have something to tell. It doesn't have to be people who have shitloads of followers or influencers, but I am looking for people who are leaders in their department. So whether it is athletics or coaching or being a cashier at the supermarket, if you're really good at it, I'm happy to talk to you. I have some really interesting guests coming up for the first few episodes. We have Emmanuel Pascari, who was Europe's strongest man under 105. And he's a really cool dude. He used to coach me for a while. We have Max Planner, who was a professional rower in the Olympics. Carrie Merriam, who's an amazing women's coach, business coach. Eva Kakzo, who is a queen of a woman. And I'm really, really excited about this. So you won't just have to listen to me blabber on for a while, but I want you to expect to listen to conversations that are not necessarily simple to digest, but easy to listen. I want this podcast to be a podcast where someone can listen casually while they're eating breakfast or driving to work and take a lot out of it and get aha moments of like, wow, oh my God, this is amazing. And at the same time, I want this podcast to also be something that someone can sit with a notepad and take notes if they wish to. Because in the end, I want this podcast to serve as a guide and a light for people to, increase consciousness, increase love in the world for the very reasons that I described before. Now, I have a lot of topics that I was thinking about talking today. There's one that I thought about that would be a really nice one to start this podcast with because everything has a beginning and an end. If you look at something from its beginning until its end and the course that it's going through, you can learn a lot about that something. Carl Jung, who is one of the most incredible individuals who ever lived, was a big learner of these journeys of things. And he kept comparing them to the journey consciousness goes through from the moment of creation in a human being until the moment of death of a human being. Because human beings are not consciousness. Human beings experience consciousness, or consciousness is a part of human beings. Human beings is part of consciousness. Human beings is one element of consciousness experiencing itself. And I don't want to get too deep into the abstract, but the topic I want to talk about is the analogy that Jung made between life of an individual and the journey of consciousness of an individual to the course of the sun throughout the day. If you want to read more about it, there's a book called The Masculine and the Feminine by Carl Jung, and it is a great book. I'm learning a lot from it. If you read this book, then you'll know when I'm saying that there's masculine and feminine energies, I'm saying that there's so many reasons why the argument that there is no masculine and feminine energies is a bunch of bullshit. There's so many reasons. If someone is able to read Jung's work and understand it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This is why so many people don't understand Jordan Peterson and don't understand people who are, let's say, on my end of the political spectrum. I'm a very liberal person in general, but today I will be considered an alt-right person just for saying that there's masculine and feminine energies and men and women are different. There is a serious complexity to the simplicity of masculine and feminine energies, which I'm not going to go into now. It was just a little sidetrack. But when I'm talking about the analogy between life and the course of the day, the simple idea is that the sun goes through a certain journey. It rises in the east, finds its way to the top of the sky, and then it starts setting towards the west. It's a lot like the journey that consciousness goes through as a baby is born, in a way. If you think about the movie The Lion King, how does it start? It starts with the sunrise, right? This is the emergence of consciousness out of the womb. Lion King, by the way, is an archetypal story of the journey of consciousness. Let's say that the time between age of 0 until the age of, say, around 20, this is the dawn of life. The sun is still young, getting stronger and stronger, clarifying, getting more clear. The world is becoming more known. There's more light shining on the world, and more of the world is becoming visible. The midday of life is anywhere around between, let's say, 20 and 60. This is where the sun is highest in the sky. And everything is, and there is like maximum light of consciousness. And in the end, let's say to 80, 50 to 90, this is where the sun is setting. This is the evening of life. Everything becomes darker, calmer, and more serene. You can really think about these 3 stages of life as sort of, there's way to act in the morning that wouldn't work for you at noon and that wouldn't work for you in the evening. So there's different rules to how someone acts in the morning, evening, and midday. All right. So for example, if you try to, go to work at the evening, most offices are closed in the evening, right? Because most people don't work in the evening. Same goes if you want to go clubbing in the morning, most clubs are closed in the morning. There are certain guidelines during the day, evening, and noon that are different. There's certain just conditions, different conditions. And it's just like that in life, because the things that we are doing at the early life are not the same as the things that we're doing at the noon of life, and definitely not the same that we're doing at the end of life. And there are certain similarities between the end of life and the beginning of life, just like when the sun is setting and the sun is rising. As you grow older, you become more and more dependent on others, just like as you are young. You are very dependent on others as an infant, and you become very, very dependent on others when you are very old, right? We can't act at noon just like we would in the morning. That sounds a little abstract, so I want to give an example. If you're in the morning of life, let's say you're 2 years old and you're throwing a tantrum. We've all seen a 2-year-old throwing a tantrum. It's unpleasant to watch. It's unpleasant to experience. A 2-year-old who's going through a tantrum is obnoxious. He's selfish. He is self-centered. He doesn't give a fuck about who is around him. He wants to scream and shout because he wants the cookie or the ice cream, or he wants to go home, or he's tired, or whatever it is. He has a certain emotion. He wants to express it. That emotion is anger, and he's throwing a tantrum. While his parents might be a little bit upset about it, and they might try to teach him, hey, you can't do that right now. We're in a public space. There is a certain understanding from society that, like, okay, he's 2 years old. He's allowed to throw a tantrum. And society tolerates it. They understand it. But if an adult throws a tantrum, let's say you're at the noon of life, you're 28 years old and you throw a tantrum, start screaming and shouting and cursing, there's not high tolerance for that, right? If an adult person starts screaming and shouting, I don't know a lot of men or women who will just stand next to them and go, okay, you're allowed. It's unacceptable, right? It's like, grow up. Like, you're 28 years old. What are you standing screaming and shouting for? Like, the funny thing around this is that we may not do this externally because we realize socially that is unacceptable, but we do that internally. A lot of times what we do in life, and this is where Jung says that there's a lot of discrepancies that happen, a lot of pain that happens, a lot of neuroticism, is when people try to apply rules that are correct for the early time of life. They try to do it in the noon of life because they're just not aware that the game has changed. This happens because a lot of people are stuck in their childhood stories. A lot of people are stuck in their childhood traumas. A lot of people are stuck in things that happened to them as kids that were never resolved. Those things psychologically. They never were able to solve the psychological matter of the issue. And they never thought that they should. Because we make this weird habit of, as we're kids, we're not very mature intellectually. The brain only fully matures when you're 25. We don't have the intellectual or emotional tools to understand what is really going on around us, right? This is why kids throw a tantrum, because they can't express what it is that they're feeling in a way that is mature. That's why kids are immature. Oftentimes it's the responsibility of the adults who are already at the noon of life or at the evening of life to explain it to them. But adults today don't do that because they don't have the tools themselves. Most of us grow up with parents who don't teach us how to think. They teach us what to think. So when we're having a tantrum, the parents tell you, calm down, this is inappropriate, but they're not explaining to you why you're having a tantrum, or they're not telling you how to overcome that tantrum. They're not giving you the tools. So you experience these psychological knots, let's call them, as a child, and you're never really resolving them. For example, your dad slapped you or your parents got a divorce, and no one really sits there and explains this to you in a way that will help your psyche reconcile with your emotions. And it just stays there, unsolved, like a knot, for years. And we make it a habit to interpret the pain that is associated with this event from the framework of a kid, from the outlook of a child. This is a rule that you can do early in life. But if you do that later in life, at the noon of life or evening of life, you become neurotic. Jung said that the difference between a neurotic person and a non-neurotic person is not pain, because both of them experience pain. But the neurotic person isn't aware. The difference between a neurotic person and a non-neurotic person is not problems, because both have problems. The difference is that the neurotic person isn't aware why he's experiencing problems, and he thinks that if he solves his problems, the pain will go away. And the non-neurotic person understands that problems is just a part of life. When you're applying early morning life behaviors at a later stage of life, or when you look at something from the outlook of a child, you will experience pain because you're unable to frame the issue emotionally and reconcile with it psychologically. Jordan Peterson says that if you have a memory that is over 18 months old and that memory causes you pain, it indicates that there is a certain psychological matter that is not resolved. Without judging, without anything like that, I mean, we all have childhood traumas, we all have issues that are unresolved, but all that indicates is that there is some psychological work to do there. Most of us, what we do is we accept the fact that we're fucked. We're saying, oh, this happened to me in childhood, therefore I am fucked. Therefore, I am allowed to behave a certain way because I'm fucked. Because I had a certain trauma. Because when I was a kid, my dad was mean to me. When I was a kid, I was abused. When I was a kid, people didn't accept me. When I was a kid, this happened and this happened and this happened. And therefore, I am allowed to be a victim. I am allowed to behave in a certain way. This, I am allowed to do that, is a bit tricky, right? Because on one end, yes, you're allowed. But on the other hand, it's a little bit immature to say, yeah, I'm allowed to do that, so I'll behave in a certain way. There's something there that is a little bit nihilistic, that is very immature, to say at least. Why should people tolerate the fact that you're allowed to act like this? The solution to this whole situation is not a simple one. It's really not. But how can we approach the situation? One thing that I would say to a client of mine who is coming to me with a problem like this, and basically we all have these problems, is that you have to understand that what happened to you at the early point of life is something that you have to approach as if you are there in the early point of life. You have to come back to that early memory and understand that it happened to you as a child. You have to look at it from that perspective of the child. And think to yourself, what is it that I needed there that the world didn't give me? What is it that this consciousness center that I have inside of me, that is that child, needs or needed that never got? And because they never got it, I learned to believe a certain something about myself or about the world. And I created a habit around this belief. And I kept acting as if this belief is true. If in the early stage of life something happened to you, and as a result you started believing something about the world or about yourself. Let's say when you were a child, someone called you ugly and you started believing that you're ugly. And then you started victimizing over the fact that people called you ugly. And you just made it a habit to believe that you're ugly. As an adult, you still believe that you're ugly because someone told you that when you were a kid. All of your life, you started presenting these behavior patterns of someone who's ugly, when in fact, maybe you're not ugly. You just thought that you are because that happened to you in early life. But now, as an adult, you have the tools to intellectually understand that beauty is a matter of the beholder, right? That everybody can be beautiful to a certain someone in a certain way, or that beauty doesn't matter, right? You can think about it from a way that is a little bit more complex. It doesn't matter how I look. What matters is what I bring to the table or what value I bring to society. There's a lot of ways where you can think about that intellectually that are kind of contradicting the fact that I'm ugly, or that kind of serve you better than just I'm ugly. However, because that psychological issue was not resolved when you were a child, because no one told you something like, for example, it doesn't matter what they're saying, they're just teasing you. What matters is the value that you bring to the table, work hard, give people value, be kind. You still think that this stupid and arbitrary argument like you're ugly has weight on you. But it's only because you haven't processed it from that emotional perspective in the dawn of life. And so it's worth to have a conversation between that part of you that experienced this type of trauma and that adult version of you who understands that this pain happened and it wasn't okay, but there is a better story to tell. yourself around this pain. When you open that channel of communication between you and yourself, you open the door to healing, to understanding what it is that kid needed at the time. Usually how I do that is I try to relive that memory. And I try to go back to that memory, or one memory, because there's obviously several, but I try to relive that moment. And I ask myself, how did I feel? What did I do? I'm trying to recreate this as much as I could. Then I say to myself, okay, and what did I need at that moment? What was a need that wasn't answered? For example, if someone called me ugly, my need was to be socially accepted, to be told, you matter, to be told, we want to be your friends, to be invited to play because the need that you wanted was belonging. And when you understand that this need was not answered, you can ask the adult version of yourself to give that to the young version of yourself and make that communication. By that, you're integrating the emotional and immature version of yourself with the intellectually and more emotionally mature version of yourself. This is where you can create healing. This is, in hippie terms, called inner child work. This is a lot of the ways to kind of like reconcile between the stage that you are right now in life and the stage that you were in life. And you'll notice that when you start doing more of that, when you start operating from this higher frequency, you become more attuned with the stage that you are in life, and neuroticism goes down. I have to say that I didn't expect to go so deep into that topic, but this is my attempt to think out loud. This is also my first time recording a solo cast. What I would ask you to do, if you're listening to this and there's questions that pop up, or if there are requests for guests, or if there are ideas that you want from this podcast, some ways that you think that I can serve you, please leave me a comment on that episode. Please leave me a comment, send me a question, DM me on Instagram, because I'm happy to serve this community of men. And if a woman is listening, I'm happy to serve you too, by giving you whatever it is that I can, because this podcast is my attempt to do something interesting that is both interesting for myself and is interesting for the community. I like to think out loud, I like to speak, and I hope that people will benefit from these thoughts and from the interviews that I'm about to do. My cat is now wanting food, so I guess that's time for me to go. Please don't forget subscribing, because I'm going to release one episode every week, and most of the time it's going to be an interview, or a conversation rather than an interview. So thank you for listening so far. I really appreciate you, and I hope that whatever I just said made some sort of sense. If it didn't, put it in the Q&A. I'll be happy to answer all of your questions. And that is it. I wish you all a wonderful day, and catch you soon.